Welcome back, everybody, and we're on to the next unit. We're going to start talking about interviewing, and we're going to talk this week about the preparations for the interview. It's really an important part of how we conduct interviews in the workplace, as important as the interview itself, quite frankly. But let's do a bit of a recap as to how we got here so far. So let me start by saying, in my original plan for this course, I had 1 week for interviews. And in no way am I going to make you a master investigator in 1 semester. It took me and I wouldn't even consider myself a master investigator because I've seen some people that are just so talented at it, work with some real pros in the course of my career that I just, I'm in awe of what they can do. But I'm pretty good at it and I get pretty good results. But you're not going to get that in a semester. But I think the big thing is that I want to make sure that you understand what could hurt you, right? That you don't make major errors, that you don't get beyond where you should be, right? Give you the basics. And I think interviews require a little more time. So my original plan when I designed the course was 1 week for interviews, and now it's going to be 2. So, strap in for that, right? It's going to be a good time. So we talked in the first week about the right mindset, right? We're calm, businesslike, we're professional. We're not throwing people against tables and threatening to throw them under the jail. We are indeed business people in a business setting. We have a good plan. We've done a good investigative plan. We know how to do that. We understand when we're talking about witnesses in interviews that they can be tricky. And I always like to say they have an expiration date because of the issues with the selective attention and the degradation of memory, right? We talked about all of those things, right? Contamination of memory. So, we understand that. The power dynamics we talked about last week, some of you may have been scratching your head saying, why is this important? Well, look, it's not just, people being afraid of their boss, but connections and the expertise that might be lost if they say something. Their job may get harder if they say the wrong thing in an interview and implicate someone who you now suspend or gets terminated as part of this matter, and their job got harder. They could also just decide so-and-so couldn't be responsible for this, no matter how many, knives are found in their hand. They couldn't have done the stabbing because they just wouldn't do that, right? So understanding the power dynamics before you go into an interview is hugely important. So let's start talking about interviewing and, the number one step really when you decide you're going to conduct interviews. So I want you to clear your mind. I like to say the stage is as important as the play. And I want you to clear your mind completely, and I want you to think about the play Peter Pan. Now, even if you've not seen the entire play Peter Pan, you all know there's a scene in there where Peter Pan and Tinkerbell go and fly, right? On the Broadway stage, Mary Martin was the person who first portrayed Peter Pan. And, they put all kinds of cables and had her fly across the stage, right? And the whole thing really hinges on this effortless flying across the stage, learning to be Peter Pan. And the lights, are the spotlights on the flying person, right? Everything's perfect. There's perfect shadows. The scenery has sparkles, right? You've seen Tinkerbell before with a little wand, and oh my gosh, the music is going, costumes are bright. Everything is just perfect when it comes to that stage part of Peter Pan flying across the stage. And then somebody puts a prop in the wrong place or a piece of scenery in the wrong place, and bang, right? Tinkerbell is face planted. And that is exactly what it feels like when you don't have the right stage set. Your entire interview feels like you've been face planted. And I will give you some examples of that, real world examples, if you don't set the stage right from jump. So you're going to see why that stage is important, how the location and the scene at that location matter. And right now we're going to talk about what could go wrong, right? And these are my faceplant moments, if you will, with 2 actual investigations that I took part in. So, case number 1, Albany, Georgia. And by the way, I said that correctly. There's an Albany, New York, and there's an Albany, Georgia. Just like those of you who may know there's a Monroe, Michigan, and I know there's a Monroe, New York. And there's maybe a Monroe, Pennsylvania, I don't know. But when you go to Louisiana, you go to Monroe. And I don't know whether it's the accent thing or just a different pronunciation, but this took place in Albany, Georgia. And I had a witness, actually had a case where an executive was accused of taking favors from workers in exchange for plum assignments, promotions, better working hours, the choice assignments essentially. And I had a witness who ran a landscaping business on the side. It was actually quite lucrative for him. And I had documentary evidence. I had emails from the exec and from this person back and forth, setting delivery dates for landscaping materials. This person was delivering high-end landscaping materials to the executive's home, and the prices that were discussed were well below market prices. He did get paid, but something that cost $100 should not be remunerated at $10, right? It was about a 10% total cost of goods that he was being reimbursed for, but he was getting favored status. Ended up with a nice promotion, a much better job in this particular facility than others. And the witness was already in that good job. He'd already had the promotions. All of the things that he had done this work for, right? All of the low-cost goods that he sold, he had already cashed in. He got his. So basically, now there was nothing more in it for him, right? He wasn't going to get demoted because he wasn't going to go and remove the landscaping materials, right? So there was very little that was going to keep him. In fact, he had leverage at this point. So he got his. He just wanted out of this situation. And this was a pretty easy interview to do because when he came in, just from the first couple questions, I knew that this guy was going to cave pretty quick. When I got to that particular site, they assigned me a room for the interview, and it was early enough in my career that I just didn't really think of the difference and think of the stage. And it was an interior conference room, right? And it had a single door, but it had a big window in the door, so you could see into the conference room. And as I was conducting the interview with this person, and again, the conversation was going clearly to the point where he was just going to tell me, well, sure, I sold it, and I sold it less than I would have gotten. It wasn't a bribe because he was asked to sell it, right? So essentially, he was pretty untouchable. All he needed to do was give me the info on this exec, and I was done, right? I had enough at that point. He was my last interview. But as we were talking, the exec just happened to wander by. This particular hallway, the exec sat at one far end of it. I was at near the other end of this hallway, which was probably 100 feet long anyway. But just past that conference room was a little break room where the coffee machine was, right? The coffee pot was. The exec wandered by to get a cup of coffee, didn't even look into the room. The witness was facing the door and the window and saw that person walk by and stonewalled. He shut down from that point forward. He wasn't sure, I think in his mind he thought maybe it was a setup. That executive walking by meant something. But he gave me nothing at all from that point forward, no matter what tactics I applied, no matter what line of questioning I applied, no matter how many times I alluded to the fact that he was in good shape in this thing. It just didn't work. And he would have been fine had he cooperated. But he was concerned about cooperating because he saw that exec. It snapped him back into the, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to me mode. And he didn't cooperate. He ended up being dismissed because he impeded my investigation. Because in our particular world, we had a training and a policy that said you had to cooperate in investigations. Not all companies have that. But he would have been fine. But in this case, he ended up being the guy that was gone first. I was able to put the case together later on some other things, but it took me weeks longer than it should have. Only because of that stage. The way that interview was staged had the witness shut down unnecessarily. But if you don't believe it once, let's try it a second time. San Diego, California. So I had a subject. When I say subject, I mean someone who is beyond the point of suspect. I know that they are guilty now. I mean, I have enough other evidence to show guilt. I'm just doing the interview at this point to see if I can get them to... In this case, I wanted both an admission, if I could get it, but also to discuss restitution because there was a significant sum of money that was being taken. Basically, this lady was on the payroll of a contracted company, but she never showed up for work, and we were paying that contracted company for her services, and she never showed up to work. The reason she wasn't showing up for the contract job was she was also working another job for us in another capacity. So she couldn't work two jobs at once, but she was collecting on two jobs at once. When we first brought and there were a number of co-conspirators on this. It takes a number of people. Somebody has to sign the payroll to say that, Jim was at work. Somebody signs your time card. Well, if that person knows you're not there and signs the time card, and turns it in, they're a co-conspirator, and usually they get a cut of whatever you're going to take. But in this particular case, her manager, after I discussed the issue with the manager, because I needed the manager's cooperation in order to look at some records on when this person had showed up to work and when they didn't, insisted that he be present. And I yielded to that. And you don't always yield to that, and we'll talk about observers in a minute here, but I yielded to it and said, okay, that's fine. And the C arrangement I had was all wrong. And I had this person on the ropes. We talked for about an hour, hour and a half, and she went through some denials. I had some, very strong documentary evidence. I had bank statements showing the paycheck that she was receiving. I had actually, she did a deposition that she had to do as part of that other job, and she swore that she was an employee of that company that she never showed up for. So I mean, I had everything I needed there, but I wanted to talk about restitution. So in order to do that, I needed an admission. Had her on the ropes. She was in tears. I mean, we're talking about the whole couldn't breathe. The tissues, I'm just pulling them out of the box and handing them to her like, one after another. Not to get graphic, but I mean, the snot bubbles were just there. Everything was just falling apart for this girl. And I had her there, and she was about to admit, and then we were going to get down to the restitution phase, and I hear from the manager, why did you do it? Now remember, we talked about the why. The why is not required. I don't need to know why you stole something. I only need to know that you stole it. Now, understanding why you may have can be very helpful in an interview. And next week, not this week, because we're talking the stage this week, but next week when we talk about the questioning phase, you'll understand why that's important. If you understand why someone might have done something, you can, tailor your questions that way. But I didn't need to know why. Just needed to know that she did it, then to talk about restitution, and then to move on. The why is the icing on the cake. But when he said, why did you do it? She snapped right back. The face got sober. The tears kind of dried up. She got hard and she said, but I didn't do this. The interruption in flow really just slapped her right back to reality. You have to remember that these are kind of a conversation, and the conversation has to continue. It has to be fruitful. It has to keep going back and forth till you get to where you want to be. And when he jumped in and said, why did you do it? Before she told us that she had, before she came out and said, yes, I did this. No matter the fact that I knew she did, and we all knew she did, we had the evidence to show that. But before she admitted it, he asked why. And that really hurt. It took me about another 8 hours with her to get her to the point where we could talk realistically about next steps. If you're interested in the outcome of that case, I can't talk about anything else, but the outcome is actually available. If you want to hit that address, it may show you the types of restitution anyway, the types of punishment that came out of that particular matter. So what did we learn from these two things? Well, the setting of the interview had a negative effect on the result. In one case, it was the physical setting. In the other case, it was the people in the room. Again, part of the setting. You need to think about the stage, and you really need to think about it beforehand and set it up in your head as to how you're going to set up that stage so that Tinkerbell doesn't face plant in that wall. Okay? Knowing the difference between what type of witness and whether this person's a potential subject really helps a lot. Remember, witnesses aren't necessarily all eyewitnesses, and a witness could be somebody who prepares documents for you, right? In a fraud matter, the accountant who found the fraud is a witness, right? They didn't necessarily see the person steal the money, but on paper they may have, or they may just be somebody who you go to and say, I need you to prepare, a financial statement for whatever, so I can see it and see the transactions this person did. They are a witness, and understand what type of witness they are, as opposed to a subject, which were the two interviews I was doing, right? And in fact, the first one was sort of a subject. I mean, what he did was not really moral, but in his case, he was going to survive, the landscape guy, right? So he was one type of witness. The next one was definitely a subject. I knew that she was part of this conspiracy to defraud. So knowing the type of witness is really helpful. And when you talk about locations, people tend to say, well, come on down to my office, let's talk about this. It's not always a friendly confine for you or for the witness, and it can have a detrimental effect on whether or not they talk to you. But if you go visit them in their office, it's not an even playing field. They can have any number of things that will distract them, that they can, think about, how am I going to get out of this? They have all of their tools around them. Okay, and outside help. When we talk about people like that manager, they're not always helpful. So let's go through these things one at a time and talk about confines. So really you have a number of choices as to where to interview somebody in a corporate investigation. You could go to your office. It's normally private. Security managers tend to have a closed door, private office. Normally if there's glass in the window, which by the way, many companies require you to have a glass in the door at least, so that no one can close the door. Bad things happen behind closed doors sometimes, and you don't want those types of accusations. But normally you'll be able to put a shade on the door, and you can ask the person, "It's okay if I close the shade?" And of course they're going to say yes, because they don't want to be seen in there. But that's an investigator supportive environment. You have all your tools there. But let's think about a friendly witness, right? Someone who's preparing documents for you. That accountant who's helping you put together your fraud case. That cybersecurity analyst who's helping you put together a cybersecurity matter, right? Because cybersecurity cases, the cybersecurity people normally are, finding the issue and bringing it forward. But generally, the security manager would be the one, the physical security manager would be the one to do interviews and put the case together. It's generally done that way in most companies, at least today. Cybersecurity people don't tend to be investigators in the interviewing sense, but they tend to be investigators in the forensic sense. But if you have a friendly witness, you bring them to your office and you say, okay, I need to see, where Joe made these financial transactions. Oh, well, that's in my office in my file. Okay, go get it. Then they come back. Okay, see this one here. Now, where did this go? Oh, I have that on my computer. Just from a practical standpoint, meeting with a friendly witness in your office is going to have you running like crazy, and you're going to forget things. So in that case, you want to be in a witness supportive environment, someplace where their tools are. You may be able to ask them about things that you wouldn't normally ask in your office, because you'll see, oh, well, I see you work on this too. How about that? How about this, right? So a witness supportive environment for a friendly witness is preferred. In any case, you have to decide whether you're going to be on company property, which is most efficient, right? Everybody's at work, so you can get them there. Or whether you're going to be off company property, which is the most private. And both of them have their uses, one certainly more than the other. You're most likely going to be on property for most of your investigations, but there are some where being off the campus, if you will, has its advantages. So let's just talk really about those. I won't call them unfriendly witnesses, because generally they're not unfriendly. But now we're past the point of gathering our data and meeting with witnesses who can provide data for us and artifacts for us. Now we're in a witness interview where this witness may become a suspect, may become a subject, or at least has information that might be uncomfortable to discuss. You want to talk about the common ground on premises, and the room you look for has no windows. Windows can be very distracting. People stare out the window and get lost in your questioning. They get distracted, and then you have to repeat yourself. You lose the train of thought. It gives them things to think about, and it shows an escape. You want to be in less traveled hallways. Your room is obviously connected to a hallway. You want it to be someplace less traveled. Just the thought of somebody walking in the room, you walking in the room, people see that, starts the rumor mill going like crazy. Funny story, one time I was actually going to hire somebody, and I was meeting with an HR director, and both of us were fairly well known. We were at a manufacturing plant of about 5,000 people, had a lot of office areas as well. And I was going to hire somebody. He said, I think you ought to talk to their current manager first. I think he was trying to talk me out of this hire, and he actually did. Person had good skills, but they also had some character flaws that I wasn't aware of. He said, come on, let's go for a walk. Well, this particular manufacturing building was well over 1 million square feet. It was huge. So we walked from our end, which was the front end, all the way to the back to meet with the manager of this person. As we walked down the hallways through all of these cube farms, it looked like a game of whack-a-mole. As the HR director and the security director walking down the hallway together, everybody assumes somebody's getting the boot, right? It's the death walk. There's going to be a perp walk coming the other direction, and everybody kind of knew that, right? Wasn't the case. We just happened to be walking together. And I even laughed, the two of us laughed and said, this is really terrible. We should be carrying an empty cardboard box just to really get the rumor mill started. But people pick up on those little cues. Be in less traveled areas. Try to make it a little bit more remote. When you get in that room, you want as little furniture as possible. furniture is a barrier, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. But you want as little furniture as possible. You don't want clutter. People tend to use conference rooms in businesses for more than conferences. You see them on TV. They're always, really, brightly lit, and there's a table and long chairs and maybe a few pictures on the wall and a lot of glass. Well, guess what? They tend to be used as storage rooms in a lot of places, because when you run out of storage space, if a business is growing, the conference room is someplace you can kind of put stuff. So you'll find that there's clutter in those places. You don't want clutter. You don't want noise. And you want as small a room as comfortable. Comfortable being the operative word here. You just don't want a big cavernous room for an intimate conversation. You want it to feel like a conversation, and you don't want the person to feel like they have other places to be in that room. You want the room to be the proper temperature and have proper lighting. Don't play the games with props. I have seen investigators put stacks of things on a table. Stacks of files that have nothing to do with the matter. And in a conversation with somebody, they say, well, we've got a lot of evidence. And they kind of glance over at the pile. The person glances at the pile. They know whether you have a lot of evidence or not, because they know the trail they left, if they are indeed guilty. Don't play the prop game, okay? Don't play the make the room too hot or too cold. Don't make it a sweat box, right? That's crazy. That's the kind of stuff you see in TV movies, but it's not reality. However, the witness should always face away from the door. Just like the windows, a door is an escape. And you'll notice people, if they're facing the door, when they get uncomfortable, they glance toward that door quite a bit. It's kind of just a natural human reaction. Always have your witness face away from the door. You want them to feel as though they're in that room. They're in the room until you're done. You're not trapping them there. You can't lock the door and say you're going to stay, and you can't hold somebody up, right? But if they're facing the door, they feel like there's a way out, and you probably want to take that illusion away, right? If there's a table, sit on the same side of the table as the person, because physical barriers create psychological barriers. And let's take a look at what I mean by that. Now, I have seen rooms that look exactly like this. In fact, at a facility where I built a interview room, where I had the budget to do it, because there were a number of investigations. It was a very large complex. It looked just like this, except no phone on the table. I was smart enough not to put a phone there, but it looked just like this. Well, first off, if you think about this, the door, if you look at my cursor here, it's got to be over here somewhere, right? Because I guess it could be over on this wall over here behind. But either way, if I'm sitting here and my interviewee is sitting here, they can see the door. First order business, right? Don't want that. Second off, you notice that my chair is bigger than this person's chair. Therefore, I'm more important than you are. Therefore, I'm threatening to you. That little subtle thing, the size of the chair, matters to the person who's sitting in the smaller one. Second off, this table is a detriment to you. This person can be sitting just as calm as can be over here talking to you, and under the table, their legs are bouncing like they're on fire. You can't see it. You can't see what they're doing with their hands if they have their hands under the table. You can't see if they're nervously twitching with their hands, right? If they're even kind of pointing towards something. I mean, you can't see any of it. It's a barrier. It's a barrier to communication psychologically, as much as it is a barrier visually to looking at the body language of the person you're talking to. And I'm not a big fan, and we'll look next week at a video of an FBI agent who talks about body language and basically says most of the quote-unquote science on body language is crap when it comes to interviewing subjects, because it just doesn't, the fact that they may cross their arms doesn't necessarily mean they're shutting you out. That's a classic one, right? Or they have their hand by their mouth means they're lying about something. They're trying to cover up what's coming out of their mouth. Well, maybe they just, that's something they normally do. Some people do that, right? And if it's normal for them, they could be telling you the absolute truth, and you'd be thinking they're lying. So don't worry about that body language stuff so much, but you can't really see anything that's unusual, any changes. That is important, seeing how people change. So, psychological barrier, right? I'm in the bigger chair. I'm across this table from you. You're over here in the corner. And a visual barrier. I can't see what's going on there. Not the way to set up a room. This room, on the other hand, is one. This is actually a picture of an interview room at the University of Illinois. Their police department put in, and they thought they were groundbreaking, setting up what they called the soft interview room, when realistically in the corporate world, we've been doing it forever. The only thing I see really wrong here is this door. You can see the door jamb over here in the lower left corner, which means that if a person's sitting here, they're kind of looking at the door. Kind of hard to set it up another way in this size room, so not the exact right place. But what you notice, the chairs are the same. They're facing each other. There's no barrier in between. This is a room where you're going to have a conversation. I'd get rid of the dead plant, by the way, but that's just me. But this is a room where you're going to have a conversation. And that is what the interview is. It is a conversation. It is one where you're trying to direct it to a certain outcome. And perhaps the person sitting over here, right, if you're the interviewer sitting on the right side and they're across the room, they may want to direct it to a different outcome. But if you keep it as a conversation, you keep the barriers free, it's going to go a lot smoother for you. So when you look at an interview room like that, and then you look at one like that, think about which one is more conducive to an open and honest conversation where there's nothing blocking the two of you, where you can get to the same resolution. And I would suggest that number 2 here is the way to do it. So the room itself, it's clean, it's comfortable, it's quiet, it's free of barriers. And you notice the room was free of artwork on the first one completely because it looked like a prison cell to me. The second one had some artwork. It was hard to see up in the corner. But you want it as free from artwork as possible because it can be distracting, right? People can start to use something in that artwork to distract them, to change their way of thinking, to even trigger an excuse that they might use to try to stonewall you in a conversation. It's usually the last-ditch effort, but it still can happen. I have found, though, that if you do have a permanent interview room somewhere, putting up a single poster with your company values on it is not a bad thing to do. That is because those posters are available in other places in your facility normally. They normally are up on every bulletin board. And it can be a reminder. So it's almost against my original contention you shouldn't have props. But in this case, that has been a reminder for me. And I've been able to refer to it. And people, it says basically that you'll be cooperative, you have the value of honesty and integrity. And that can be very helpful. And then same size chairs, same height, no bright lights, no cold and hot rooms. Don't play those games. Make the room conducive to a conversation. Now, if you need to go off premises, my suggestion would be to use a hotel, but get a meeting room, never, ever a guest room. The reason I say that is because hotels have a lot of people that come and go, and a hotel in the town where you are, your subject and your factory, if it's a factory or your office building is unlikely to have employees that go there. I mean, when was the last time, other than maybe to a restaurant and a hotel, when was the last time you went to a hotel in your hometown? Hotels are something that strangers go to, right? You're not from there, so you go to the hotel. Get a meeting room. Every hotel has a meeting room. In Slippery Rock, the Hampton Inn has a small meeting room, right? Downstairs. I think they have 2 of them, actually. Every hotel has a small meeting room that they lease out for very reasonable rates. Make sure you get it for the day. Interviews always take longer than you anticipate. You rent it for the day, and you ask them beforehand about things like lunch and bringing in bottled water. Look, we're not throwing a party, but think about if you start interviewing somebody at 9 a.m. and they haven't flipped by noon, right? You're going to want to get some lunch. I don't know about you, but I get hungry, right? And so does the person there, and you're not there to, deprive them of anything. But when it gets close to 11:30 and you say, okay, I'm going to be here a while because this person's just not going where we need them to go, but I know that they're guilty, I have enough evidence, then perhaps you go and order lunch and have it brought in. Don't take any long breaks. You don't want those long breaks. Sure, if they need to use the restroom, let them use the restroom. Ask them to leave their cell phone in the room if they would. They can shut it off. In fact, you should ask them to shut off their cell phone, and we'll go over that next week. But if they have their cell phone shut off, they shouldn't need to turn it back on. This isn't a time to take business calls. It isn't time to take personal calls. So you want to avoid the long breaks. Now, typically, you're not going to use off-premise. I've only used it maybe 3 or 4 times in my entire career. But it helps with witnesses who have been suspended. You don't want to necessarily bring them back into the workplace. If you have a suspended witness, a subject, right? Somebody that you're reasonably sure is guilty and they've been suspended pending your investigation. You don't want them invited back into the workplace. It could easily turn into a workplace violence incident, either because they brought in something with them, be it a weapon or whatever, or because they simply know that the end is near and they're going to go out in a blaze of glory and, if nothing else, get in a shouting match and scream and yell and let everybody know what they really think of the place. Sometimes it's better with a suspended witness to have that off-premise meeting. And then with higher-ranking employees, if it is indeed a subject interview, it certainly cuts down on rumors. You don't want the security manager constantly going into the big boss's office to interview them or to have them in a conference room with you for a long period of time where people see and they understand what's going on after a while. So it cuts down on the rumors. That's the reasons to use off-premise. But when we talk about off-premise, there are places that you absolutely never should do an interview. Cafeterias in your facility and other common areas. Even when it's a witness that is relatively friendly or a witness who's supplying you things. People see you together with that witness. They assume the worst. You're always just feel compelled to go sit in the corner somewhere of the cafeteria so you're away from anybody else. Somebody walks up with their cup of coffee to come over and talk to you, interrupts both the flow and then asks to sit down. Then you have to tell them, well, you're kind of busy. Then they immediately, put the two and two together and understand that something's going on. Starts huge rumors. Don't ever do that, right? An office of some kind is better than a cafeteria, no matter what, right? And common areas. Restaurants and coffee shops, again, those are the types of places where other employees may come in during their off time or come in. If your interview goes long, they're coming in to grab some lunch, meeting with other people for business meetings. They see you there meeting with somebody during the workday, and it's taking longer than a 15-minute break. The rumors will start. Vehicles, unless it's absolutely necessary, don't meet with somebody in a vehicle off premises. Did this once in Memphis, Tennessee. A friend and I had a case. We were working together. We flew in. We were unarmed. We had a rental vehicle. We had this big old Suburban, and our subject had been terminated already, but we wanted to meet with her to discuss how she got away with a particular crime, and it was a crime. And to try to mention restitution, which we knew wasn't going to happen, but we were going to try to go there. And I remember joking with him saying, so this is how it ends, you and me in a Suburban in Memphis. And we laughed, but this person was going to get in the back seat. We had no idea what she was bringing with her. She had a big purse when she got in. So here we are sitting in the front seat at a disadvantage. Now, it was kind of hilarious because he was in the driver's seat, I was in the passenger seat, and we conducted the entire interview on our knees, turned around, looking at the person. I don't know what we were going to do except maybe take one in the face, but we were at least prepared to do something because we realized that this was a bad move to have this interview in the parking lot of a Dollar General, by the way, in Memphis, Tennessee. So don't do that because it's just unsafe. Homes of employees, they have the full advantage in their home. They know where everything is. So just don't meet with people in their homes. Any number of things can happen. I banged down a door of a guy in rural South Carolina once, and I heard something going on in the garage, so I kind of moved over toward the garage because you could hear, the door was close to the garage, and I could hear rumblings in the garage, right? A door moving, and a car starting up, and the door came up, and then he backed up and tried to hit me with his BMW. Just not a safe place to be. Stick to your own venues that you pick, either on-premise or off-premise, but you pick them. Don't go anywhere where you wouldn't be comfortable going no matter the circumstances. You don't want to take a lot of people with you for your own safety if you're going to have an interview, because we're going to talk a minute about observers and how that can backfire on you. So just don't go anywhere where you're not comfortable going, even on a good day. And don't ever go anywhere where the subject or suspect recommends the location. That may sound silly, but it's easy to get in that conversation. Hey, I need to meet with you, Bob. We need to talk about a matter at work, and I'm going to need about an hour of your time. And Bob says, oh, yeah, why don't we meet, I'll tell you what, I was going to play softball. Why don't we meet in the parking lot at the park at 5 o'clock? You say, great. Bob just picked a location where you may get hurt. Don't let somebody else pick the location. That's your job. Say, no, you know what, let's meet at the Holiday Inn, actually. I've got some business over there, and there's a meeting room downstairs. They let me use it all the time. It's not a problem. Why don't you meet me over there about 9 o'clock tomorrow morning? Well, I have to work at 9 o'clock tomorrow. Don't worry about that. I'll take care of that. I'll clear that with your boss. No problem. Why don't you just meet me over there? And they'll say, okay, and you've picked the place, and you control the place, and you get there half hour early, and you check out the place, and you make sure that everything is where you want it to be. Don't ever go where they recommend. Now, while this is a busy slide, I just wanted to bring it up this week because we're going to talk about it again next week a little bit and the week after when we talk about cool tools. But this is some of the information you want to know before you start an interview. You want to know the person's position, tenure, organizational structure, right? That's all part of the power dynamics. You want to know their marital status, dependents, and living arrangements. Okay? You want to know their basic pay grade and their home value. You can get that actually. You can put it in, you can go like Zillow.com and put in anybody's address and it will come back with an estimated home value, right? I think that they're a little off, but it puts it into a bracket, right? So I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I just put mine in just as I was recording this, just to see, came back with my home value at like $360,000. And in Grand Rapids, that would put me in a upper middle class neighborhood, which is about right, quite frankly. So it gives you a general idea of my lifestyle, right? If you live in a neighborhood like that and you're working a job where I'm making, say, $15 an hour, that could be problematic. Either I have a big inheritance or I am up to my eyeballs in hock. You want to know that because it could be the motive. It could be the why that will help you get there, right? You don't have to prove the why, but knowing the why is helpful. Okay? You want to think about social media presence. I have had cases where social media presence, some of the things people have said on social media made for very good bargaining chips. Political affiliation, feelings on faith and family. You know that religion is not something you can use in the workplace, with the exception of understanding whether that is something that is important to a person in an interview like this. It is fair game in that regard, right? When I said no props, I actually saw somebody put a Bible on the table, and somebody that they knew, they'd done their background, right? They'd done a basic Google searches for the most part, understood this person was very active in their church, very big on faith and family. They put a Bible on the table. That's a prop that, oh my gosh, it's just don't do that, right? Don't use props. However, knowing that family is important to them. When you start talking about the behavior that they may be accused of, you can kind of couch it in such a way. Again, this is stuff for next week, but these are the types of things you want to know before you go in so that it makes your interview easier. So I just want to touch on this a little bit. Really, it's more for next week and the week after, but and I'm going to show you how you can get all this stuff pretty easily. So what about observers? Unfortunately, when you have to do an interview, oftentimes you need to, I won't say get permission, but you need to notify certain people that you will be interviewing someone. It could be HR. It could be the person's manager, because you're going to have them away from the workplace for a while. It could be your company lawyers. Your lawyer, not theirs. And if the person is a member of a labor union, they have the legal right to have a union rep present during any interview. So observers could be in any of those brackets, could be some others. But for the most part, that's your main four that you're going to have people who request to be part of your interview. So just a couple things on observers. So if the observer is the person's manager, you should try to avoid that at all costs of having the person's manager in the room. They are very unlikely to be frank and forthcoming with their own manager in the room, especially if it involves something going on in that department, and that's the only reason the manager would want to be there. The other reason is think of the power dynamic, not just the I'm your boss dynamic, but the manager has a vested interest in how this thing turns out. Either they are a supporter of the person you're interviewing and they want to see them survive, or they can't stand the person and they want to see them hang. Very little middle ground when it comes to managers. But even if they don't support the person, it could be that that person has expert power, informational power, some type of coercive power even over that manager. The close working relationship between subordinates and a manager really increases the potential for any one of those types of power dynamics we talked about, power sources we talked about last week, to be in play. Having them in the room will definitely impact the way the interview goes. It may lengthen it, which is a best case scenario, and it may scrub the whole thing, which is a worst case scenario. Avoid it at all costs. HR, sometimes you want them in the room, sometimes you don't. Sometimes it may be a requirement of your company, but you want to make sure you coordinate on how the interview is going to go. Who's going to ask the questions? Who's going to ask which questions? Sometimes it's better to play off each other. I've had really good HR people that I've been able to do that with. For the most part, though, you want them to be a witness to the interview, but not necessarily part of it, but you need to coordinate that. Oftentimes, your company may want a lawyer present, especially if the thing being investigated is something that is a regulatory violation, right? I mean, somebody did something that you may have to report to the government, and you're investigating that. You're helping with that investigation. Your company lawyer needs to be there. There's a thing called the Upjohn advisement, and it was from a legal case where there was a lawyer doing the investigation, talking to an employee about something. It was a regulatory thing that they did that needed to be reported. And the person came back later after they were fired and said, wait a minute, I shared this with my lawyer. And it wasn't their lawyer, it was the company's lawyer. And the person was confused. The Upjohn advisement simply advises somebody in an interview that there's a lawyer present in the room and they are a representative of the company, not of the person being interviewed. And that any disclosure, any third-party disclosure, is at the will of the company. And that attorney-client privilege is between the lawyer and the company, not the lawyer and the person being interviewed. So you can look up the Upjohn advisement. It gives the exact language you should use or that the lawyer should use. If you have a lawyer present, they should do that. In fact, you might want to jog their memory if they're not somebody who does employment law a lot, saying, you're going to take care of the Upjohn advisement. Yep, I am. Great. Union reps are an interesting thing. A member is absolutely allowed by law to have a representative of the union present with them if they are a union member during any type of investigative interview. That is a fact. However, that rep is not allowed to impede that interview. And you're going to decide if the interview is even worth that. So, I'm a member of a labor union at Slippery Rock University. All faculty are. And I have worked with labor unions for a very long time, and I find them to be, good and bad. Let's just put it that way, right? I mean, there are some very good ones that have a purpose. There are others that don't. You're not anti or pro-union when you make a decision as to whether or not you even want to conduct the interview with that rep present. If you think the person's bringing the rep just so they can say, well, I'm not answering your question, I'm not answering your question, and you've worked with those reps before that are, constantly interrupting your interview, you may just say, I appreciate the fact that you are entitled to that rep, but I've decided to forego the interview, and I'll just go with the information that I have present to me today. I'll go with what I know. Oftentimes, that may have the person change their mind. You're not telling them they can't have a rep. You can't ever say that. It's illegal. What you're telling them is that I've just decided I don't think I want to do this interview. And you're not compelled to do that. If you think that, the person has a lot to add, that's great. And you have to do a full and complete investigation. We know that, right? But it doesn't mean that particular interview is required, especially if it's a witness that's not a subject or a suspect. You may want to just forego it if they're going to make it harder on you. Again, it's not a matter of saying they can't have a rep. It's just saying, I guess we'll just skip it. So those are your options on observers. But let's just say that observers are going to be there. We'll call it one observer, but it could be more than one, but normally it's just one. Okay? They are observers, not participants. You should have them seated behind the witness. You saw those 3 chairs in that soft interview room from before. That's not the perfect setup when you have 3 people in the room, when you have an observer. In fact, I'm not quite sure what the 3rd chair was. I guess it could have been for a witness to the interview for the police department. They may have put it in there where 2 policemen talk to 1 person. I guess I'm not sure what that setup was for in that regard. I would have set that exact room up with 2 chairs. But they need to be seated behind the witness. I'll show you a diagram in a second. They stay silent unless otherwise arranged, right? And before you begin, you discuss this with the observer before the witness gets there. If you have a question, raise your hand. And as soon as I get to the point where I can break my line of questioning, I will ask you to pipe in. Raise your hand. Stay silent until called on. Just like in elementary school, raise your hand if you have a question. Now with the union rep, if they're going to protect somebody, if they think, you tell them, okay, if you think that my line of question is absolutely out of line, raise 2 hands. I'll stop then. But don't pipe in. Raise your hand, and I will call on you. Okay? The whole idea is they observe, not participate. The reason they're seated behind is because the witness will eventually forget they're there. It doesn't take very long, quite frankly. Okay? If it's a willing observer that will take a written statement for you, have them be a note taker, like the HR person. Or your lawyer, if they decide they're not going to participate, in the interview, they're going to just be an observer, have them take your notes for you. A union rep's not going to do that for you, but your friendly observers will, right? The manager shouldn't, but the others who are not attached to the interviewee can take notes for you, and that's okay. So let's take a look at just the basic layout of what that looks like. So here's our interview room. Got a door up here, right, where you come in. Here's your observer seated and looking this way. Chair facing this direction. Witness right here. Investigator right here. A couple things are going on here that might not be obvious. First off, the witness can't see the observer without turning completely around. They know they're there, but after a while they'll start to forget about the person behind them. As long as that person is not interrupting and making a fool, they'll forget it. They can't see the door. There's not an escape. This is a solid wall. They're not thinking about getting outside, right? They're talking to you. And you've shortened this distance of the room. Okay? This is a pretty short distance. Let's just say this room is even 15 by 15. Now this person's about 7 feet away from a solid wall. There's nothing between you and them. Okay? You're against the wall. They're not. So they're free in the floating space, but they're free in a much tighter space. They're really in about a 7 by 7 here because they can't see what's all behind them, all this open space back here. And they can't see the door. They feel slightly confined, but they're not confined at all. You keep it simple. Again, no artwork, no other furniture, no plants, okay? Those types of things. Keep it as simple as possible. Keep the observer in their place. Use that raise your hand rule and set those rules of the observer up front and do it first, right? And when I was writing this out, I said, don't be afraid to set the rules. In fact, do it first. Be sure you talk to that observer before you get started saying, these are the ground rules. Raise your hand or raise two, but don't interrupt my interview. So key takeaways. The scene's very important to getting what you seek, right? You don't want to face plant. Pick the location that matches the interview and the interviewee. It can be an investigator supportive one. It can be a witness supportive one, depending on what that witness is providing. If they're simply providing information to you and they are not in any way going to be a suspect or subject, then a witness supportive environment is just fine. Their office works better. That's where the information is. Don't think about interrogations. That one room we looked at looked like an interrogation room. This is a conversation. This is an interview. It's a conversation. Okay? In a comfortable room that's conducive to an interview, that's conducive to that conversation. Always allow more time than you think you'll need. So if you are off premises, or if you need to use a room, if you're using a conference room, which is, sometimes the way you have to go, book it for the day. Don't book it for an hour and have somebody knock on the room and say, oh, we're having a production meeting in here, you're going to have to move. You will blow your interview. Always allow more time than you think you're going to need with your location. When it comes to observers, they aren't a good thing, but you'll need to work with them. Okay? Even the HR one who's friendly, your own lawyer, company lawyer who's friendly, it just tends to make your interviews a little bit harder to do. So make sure they're absolutely necessary. If there's a lawyer in the room, it needs to be your lawyer. Unlike a criminal investigation, and when you're interviewing somebody, they do not have the right to an attorney present in the workplace. They can say, no, I'm not going to meet with you, and that's fine. And that normally means that that you go to HR and say, this person is impeding my investigation, and they normally get terminated without cause. Okay? Union employees have the right to a rep present. That is the law. However, you decide whether you're going to do the interview at all. Unless it's absolutely imperative for you to meet with that person, then if they want a union rep, you decide whether or not the juice is worth the squeeze. Okay? Non-participating observers in the room, but out of the view of the witness. That seating chart. Set them behind. They'll forget they're there. And emphasize that raise your hand rule, because that's what's going to keep the flow of your interview going. So next week, we're going to talk about the actual questions and the way you stage an interview when it comes to the questions and how you put them in order so you can take a person from basic information gathering to the point where they are telling you that they indeed committed the offense that you're investigating. But we're still in this week, the lecture. You just saw the lecture. Thank you very much for your attention. Hope you enjoyed it. There's some light reading this week. It's a few other opinions on settings. They're very much like the ones that I give, I think. There could be a few different ones. And, look, my way's not the only way. So, read some of these others and think about how you might want to improve upon them. I'd be happy to hear about that. There's a discussion due. If your last name begins with A all the way through H in the alphabet, you'll do discussion 1. If it's I through Z, you'll do discussion 2. I will list them as discussion 1, discussion 2. A through H, you do 1. I through Z, you do 2. Initial discussion, 250 words minimum, is due Thursday at midnight, 11:59 p.m. Thursday. Comments and responses of 150 words. Now that is longer than we have done before, but it is certainly not that much longer. It's a couple more sentences, but some of the responses have been very thin. So we're going to up that 150 words each. That's due Sunday at 11:59 p.m. 2 responses minimum. And I only want you to respond to someone who did the opposite initial topic as you did. So if your last name is Wisniewski and you are doing discussion 2, because you're through the I through the Z range, right? You're going to comment on someone who did discussion 1 and vice versa. With that, have a great week. I'll be available all week if anybody needs to talk to me, and you know how to get a hold of me. So I will see you on campus.